sounds like a stupid question.
Probably is, because, yeah, go ahead. Skilled managers equals high morale, which equals all that cool stuff that you cannot pay for and you can't punish for.
When you close off that feedback channel, you are not going to be able to hear the truth.
In the first microseconds, your brain can't tell the difference between physical danger and what we call social danger.
I'm pissed off at you.
Me, specifically?
Well, just because you're my boss and all.
Employees tend to get promoted until they reach their level of incompetence. Go forward and don't suck.
Hey, folks. Welcome to the Managing with Mind and Heart podcast. We're excited to be here with you today, folks. I'm Ethan Nash, one of your co-hosts, and with me today, I have my regular partner in crime,
Michael Nash.
Let us not delay further. Let's jump right into the episode today. Mike, what are we doing today? What the heck are we talking about?
We've talked about meetings a number of times in these podcasts, and one of the things that comes up a lot with organizations and groups is, how do we create a really effective set of sort of rules for meetings, code of conduct? How do we help ensure that our people are showing up and really effectively participating in the meeting in a way that makes the meeting enjoyable and successful and effective, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that today. How's that sound?
That sounds good. Let's do it.
Yeah. Well, this is it's tempting to go back and just review all the stuff on meetings. Let's not do that. I think we really have had a couple of really great conversations about meetings. Can we just maybe just review a couple big picture concepts, just some principles, and one of those being meetings really matter, right? I mean, this is where there's decision making and culture shows up, and respect or lack thereof, and how decisions are made, and so many things show up right there. Psychological safety, the power differential. It's important that people meet to build culture and make decisions and do all this really cool stuff. And it's really important that meetings are run really, really well. And I know that sounds so obvious, but what are the results when you have meetings that are not run well, that don't have agendas, that go on too long, that spin in circles? What's the repercussions of that for an organization?
They suck, in all seriousness. So yeah, meetings that are not intentional, not well designed. One of the biggest things is people are just going to tune out, right? And your whole meeting becomes ineffective, right? They're not engaged in it. They're not going to contribute to the conversation. And they often turn into what I've seen, just kind of a reporting out session. All of our meetings are just here. So the leader of the meeting is just going to share information because nobody wants to talk about anything.
Yeah.
So that's one result.
Yeah. And you don't get collaborative or creative. People don't support decisions later because they didn't feel energized or involved or engaged. Morale is lowered, right? It's just a pain. And what we said before, and it's such an important principle, meetings really do reflect the culture of the organization. They're a microcosm. You can see the culture of the organization right there in meetings. And we've told stories about that in other podcasts, but it's true and it's important because the really good news is by improving meetings, by running great meetings, by having meetings that are effective and enjoyable, you can actually, in a sense, reverse engineer the culture. You can infuse into the culture really good things by improving meetings. And we keep seeing that over and over again with our clients. As they improve their meetings, it kind of leaks out into the broader culture, which is really cool to see. Yeah. So that's some real high level basic stuff. But so we've talked a lot about, like having a really good agenda. I want to emphasize here again, the prime importance of facilitation skills. And I just want to take one quick note on this. We've talked about the Peter principle, right? People tend to get promoted to managers, or they rise up in the organization until they reach their level of incompetence, meaning that, welcome to management, good luck. We're not going to give you any skills. Just go for it. And it's dangerous, and it's bad for the manager, and it's bad for the employee, and it's bad for the organization. It's very similar to what happens with meetings, right? Welcome to meeting facilitation. Good luck. You're going to know how to do all these things, which is a really complicated job, right? How do you run a good meeting and air traffic control things and have a good agenda and, lead discussion and engage and create consensus and all these important things? That's just a lot of things to know how to do. And so just before we roll into kind of the topic for today, another shout out to our listeners, our organizations. Please consider training your facilitators, because if they're doing their job really well, you're going to have great meetings, which is going to leak out into the culture.
Absolutely. And I will just give a quick plug that we actually have a free ebook that we'd be happy to send to you if you email us at contact@nashconsulting.com. And this ebook is a deep dive into better meetings. And we kind of do an overview of, ways and reasons to meet, talking about who should attend meetings, who should ideally be in your meetings. We talk about ingredients of highly effective and enjoyable meetings. We talk about maybe some steps you can take if you feel like you're in too many meetings. We talk about making remote meetings work. So it's a pretty fun, cool guide. Again, send us an email and we'll send you that free guidebook.
Let's talk about kind of getting to, we have the facilitator doing their job well. We've got an agenda. We don't have too many meetings. We have a passing period. We have all these things, let's say, in place. But we now also have to talk about the role that participants' behaviors play in meetings being effective and enjoyable. So one thing I'll say let's move on to this. Let's have some fun with this. Let's just talk about some behaviors. What would be some of those behaviors? And let's include remote and hybrid meetings as well here. But what would be some of those behaviors that people could bring to the table that impact the meeting negatively? Let's say, let's just throw some of the things out on the table and make a quick list here.
And I'll answer that question. First, I just want to say, kind of the reason why we're talking about this, and this may seem obvious to some people, but you can have, great facilitator, a great agenda, the right people in the meeting, and all the, the elements and the conditions for having effective meetings. But if there's no focus on how people behave in the meetings, it all falls apart. Right?
Yes.
Which is why we're talking about behaviors here. What behaviors make or break an effective meeting. And so we're talking about the behaviors that would break an effective meeting, it sounds like.
Yes.
The one thing that comes to mind is people that just show up late, right? If it's part of the meeting culture, we may walk in 5 minutes late. One behavior that would harm it.
Yeah. People showing up late. That's great. Let's throw these back and forth. The person who comes to the meeting and brings all their other stuff and their work and their phone and just does stuff, during the meeting, just doesn't just engage, but multitasks during the meeting, whether it's electronics or paperwork or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Or a person or people in general that take up a whole lot of airtime, like way more than their fair share. Right. They kind of talk on and they take up most of the conversation, not giving other people a chance to contribute because we only have an hour and you're talking for 30 minutes of it.
The sidebars, right? I'm going to turn in and chat and talk to the person next to me. And it might even be about what we're talking about, but of course that distracts the leader and it distracts everyone else, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And I would say, and this is obviously harder to see, but if you're doing a remote meeting, having a lot of like side chats, right? Private direct messages to people, right? It's kind of the same thing as having side conversations. But it distracts the person that you're chatting with. It distracts you. So I would add that.
Yeah. I think also kind of get into some of the emotional IQ stuff around, interrupting people, maybe instead of hearing what they said and maybe even paraphrasing it, just immediately knocking it down, and naysaying everything that comes up. So those sort of negative behaviors, negative ways of interacting with your colleagues would count in this category.
Yeah, and under that bucket, I would throw in what I'm calling too much advocacy over inquiry, meaning that if people general in the meeting's MO is to advocate for their point of view or how they see things, as opposed to trying to understand other people and their point of view, right? If it's very lopsided in that can really harm, the meeting and any kind of collaborative conversations as well.
Yeah. That goes with sort of the win-lose style, or the my way or the highway, or I'm just going to fight for what I want and not really collaborate or listen or engage. Right. That's good.
And here's another one. How about people just not coming prepared to the meeting in general? And that just kind of flies, right? Mm-hmm. We send out the agenda in advance. We ask you to look over this report or come in with this material or whatever it may be. And that just doesn't happen. And it's just, okay, that's fine, right? We just let that slide, right?
Yep.
And that becomes a culture pretty quickly, and things don't get done that need to get done in meetings.
Yeah. Or I waste all the time in the meeting going over the stuff they should have gone over before, right?
Mm-hmm.
Another one would be just the side trips, and regardless of what the agenda says, we're going sideways and we're going to talk about this instead, and bringing in lots of other things, and not letting the agenda or the facilitator air traffic control, right? Maybe a little bit more to the kind of the remote meetings too. So things like not showing up visually, not being on camera, which there's a lot of side things we can say about that. So kind of not participating in that way. I've even had situations where we go into kind of side breakout rooms and people don't go in and don't participate. We could even step back to all meetings now and just think about just not participating, right? Just kind of being there, present, barely, but certainly not showing up with any kind of heart and mind. Lots of stuff like that. So, these are the reason we're talking about this, right? Is because these are real things, and these are things that managers talk about with us as we're doing trainings, and they want to know, what do you do about all this? Let's play with some ideas. Like, what are some tools and strategies for managers so that they can kind of get a handle on this aspect of effective and enjoyable meetings? I really, really believe that the better your meetings are planned, the better they're run, the more engaging you are as a facilitator, the more you follow your agenda, all these things we've been talking about with our groups for years and years and years. The more you do that, the much more likely people are going to show up and bring their best self. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. You can identify all the behaviors that you want to see in a meeting and all the behaviors that you don't want to see in a meeting. But, if you don't have a well-designed agenda and people don't know what we're talking about, that's not going to allow them to show up prepared. It's not going to allow them to, think about these topics in advance. They're probably going to be less engaged because I don't even know what we're talking about today. So, I mean, it's all of kind of the upfront things you do in terms of planning a good meeting, planning a reasonable meeting. Like, we can actually cover all of these items in the 90 minutes we have. That's all going to contribute to better behaviors.
Yeah. And I want to dial in on that because I don't have any research to back this up, but I believe that most of the time when you're seeing sort of chronic, these behaviors showing up in a very chronic way, I think it's not about employees just not, bringing their best self. It's not just that. I think what we're seeing most likely is just meetings that aren't being run very well. I mean, because if I go to a meeting and the wrong people are there, or I don't even need to be there, I don't even have a place in it, or it's super boring, or you stacked my meetings so that I can't get my work done, I'm going to bring my work with me, or I'm going to check out, or I'm going to get discouraged, or if you're not engaging me, I'm going to check. I mean, I really think that most of the time the behaviors we're talking about actually stem from the meetings not being planned well and not being run well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, absolutely. I would say, just from my perspective, the biggest complaint that I hear about people in meetings is I'm in meetings that I don't need to be in, right? We talk about things that doesn't affect me at all. And that's just part of designing a good meeting, right? That's another component of it, right? Having the right people that make sense, or, talking about things that a group should talk about together, not just talking about things that, it matters for one or two people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what I hear often is like, I'm in a meeting, but for 90% of us, the topics are irrelevant. So I disengage, I start doing other work, I start having side conversations. So yeah, I think we're on the same page with that.
Well, and flipping that into sort of a positive way of saying it, here's the thing. If I go to meetings and I'm pleasantly surprised by, wow, that felt productive. We stayed on course. It was even fun. It was energizing. It didn't suck my soul. It actually gave me energy, right? Man, I am, without even thinking about it, you're going to get more of my best self every time. So I just, a shout out to training facilitators and doing all the good stuff ahead of time. And let's go back to, we still have to focus on meeting behaviors, right? So how do we get a group to commit to and practice a set of meeting behaviors that are going to really help those meetings go well?
Well, you said, key word there about, it's about commitments, right? And so, I mean, yeah, imagine this, right? You've created the conditions for an effective meeting, those things we talked about, a good agenda, having the right people in the room, all that stuff. Now I think it's a process in which you sit down in a meeting with your whole team and you start brainstorming this together, right? You start saying things like, okay, what are the behaviors that would make this meeting really ineffective, would suck the soul out of all of us? What are those behaviors? And then, of course, flipping the script and saying, all right, and so then what are the behaviors that would make this an excellent meeting, that's highly productive, that's highly engaging, that we feel like we can bring our authentic selves to the meeting and show up as ourselves. I mean, so I think you do a brainstorming process here and kind of figure out what do we want to commit to and doing and what do we not want to commit to doing, as a general overview of the process that I often walk people through.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if your team is bigger than 4 or 5 people, I would split it up first too and use the small group version of this and just have them brainstorm those lists, all the behaviors you'd want to see and all the behaviors that would be that would take away from our effectiveness as a meeting. Bring those folks together and make huge lists, and don't spend time evaluating or making decisions first. Just get everything up on the board. See if everybody can agree that these are the behaviors that we don't want, and these are the behaviors that we do want. We've talked recently about decision-making styles, and I want to throw that in here. So this is a really cool opportunity. What we're doing here is we're using style 5. And Ethan, what is a style 5 decision?
Style 5 is our consensus decision-making option.
Absolutely. And this is one of those situations where, I'm not going to use style 1. Here's the code of conduct, everybody, that I've created for you. I don't really even need to use 2 or 3. 2 would be, here's my draft of a code of conduct. What do you think? Then I'll decide. 3 would be, give me all your ideas and I will create your code of conduct. This is a beautiful opportunity for a style 5. And we don't have a lot of these in some cases. So let's take them when we can get them, right? So let's work together on this and agree together is the way I would recommend that people use a style 5 for this decision.
And so after explaining what you're doing with the group, maybe breaking up into small groups to have this discussion, we've talked about already some of the negative behaviors that maybe would show up on a list that we should avoid doing. Now, do you want to talk about, maybe some good suggestions for things that should show up on the list of, hey, let's practice these behaviors to make this effective meeting? Do you want to brainstorm on that a little bit, or?
Yeah, that sounds great. And when you're making the list, you can actually draw lines between these. So you can see that they're sort of 2 ends of the spectrum. So the opposite of interrupting would be, waiting your turn. Another example would be, instead of just kind of rudely disagreeing with someone or knocking down their opinions or whatever, you might say, hey, it would be really cool if we, when we heard an idea that we weren't quite sure about, that we asked some questions or we paraphrased, right? So you can kind of contrast these negatives and positives. So yeah, what are a couple of those other items on the happy list, Ethan?
On the happy list, yeah. Well, a big general bucket here, and of course, a lot of these behaviors are going to relate to this, but I've heard people say, hey, we will practice behaviors that create psychological safety, which is a whole lot of behaviors, right? But for example, we'll have an eye on asking for help and feedback during the meeting. We will give feedback to people in a meeting that focuses on, the task or the project or the behavior, rather than that feedback being about that person or that person's character or the person's attitude, right? And this would also include, hey, let's not punish people for mistakes or for not knowing, right? And punish, I'm using that term loosely, but hey, if I speak up to ask a question that I might think this might be a dumb question, I might be the only one in the room that doesn't know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyways. And then someone says, well, that's a dumb question, right? Like, we're not going to punish people for not knowing, right? Or for making a mistake. So a few things right there under the bucket of creating psychological safety in the meeting.
Yeah.
And by the way, I would also just point out that psychological safety gets built on a lot of different levels. It gets built on a one-on-one individual level, but I think one of the main mechanisms or avenues for building psychological safety is in those group meetings, right? When the group is all together.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. I love that. Psychological safety would include, we will, you mentioned feedback. My default might be to give you feedback privately, not in the group, right? That would help with psychological safety. Lots of things. And that reminds me that concept, when it comes up, psychological safety, I think you can put that up on the top of your list as a kind of an overall principle that we're shooting for. Same thing when they say, this happens a lot, right? So what are the behaviors we're looking for? Well, respect. Okay, we're going to be respectful. Right. Well, that's not a behavior, and it's not super helpful. And I've seen way too many code of conducts on the wall of meeting rooms that say we're going to be respectful, and no one comes in and reads it every day and says, oh, that means I am going to not interrupt. And they don't do the extrapolation. So when you get from the brainstorming, when they say respect, honor that, say awesome, let's put that up on top as another one of our overall principles, but let's make sure we get to the behaviors that support that.
And they often get to a lot of those behaviors that, again, relate right back to psychological safety. But what else? What would be some other good behaviors that would make for successful, effective meetings?
Again, I go back and say, assuming that the meetings are run well and there's not too many, et cetera, you've dealt with that. Show up ready to engage and not multitask, right? So put away the phone, or again, at least don't use it. Have it next to you in case there's an emergency. Close your computer unless you're actively using it for a purpose related to the meeting. Put that stuff away and actively engage. And that means with your body language, that means, respond to questions, have your skin in the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A group I was working with several months ago, one of their meeting code of conduct behaviors was, we will give positive feedback when we notice something good in that meeting, which
Yes.
I thought was so cool on a number of levels. One just being, coming back to something you said earlier, meetings are a microcosm of the culture, right? So I think the behaviors that we can practice in a meeting will end up permeating out to the rest of the culture, right? Yep. So let's practice in this meeting. Hey, let's give positive feedback on good work, on a good question, on being willing to speak up with your opinion. There's a lot of opportunities to just give positive feedback throughout a meeting.
Yeah. When you add in remote meetings, right, it's show up physically on camera, and we could go sideways in this. We maybe won't do that today, but I know there's exceptions and I know there's other factors, but what I'm seeing with organizations, especially post-pandemic, is they're realizing that they need to kind of catch up in terms of some of these expectations, and they're not okay with people just not being physically present. It's like showing up for the meeting in the building, but staying outside the room and listening in, through the door. You got to show up, and all these other behaviors apply in the remote world even more. Like when you're multitasking and doing other things, it's really obvious and it's really distracting. And so again, making sure that we have the same general types of expectations and agreements and commitments, regardless of whether we're in person or remote. Running a remote meeting, takes even more skills. And so, the better that meeting is run, the better you use your breakout rooms, the better you engage, right? You're going to have much better behaviors. But yeah, we're moving toward this exercise where the group is brainstorming all these behaviors, right? They're brainstorming the negatives and the positives. Any last call on what some of those might be, Ethan, before we kind of move forward?
Yeah, some that I've seen come up before, and I think some of these will be unique for your group, but I've seen one group commit to more of a mindset, which is, if we're asking for people's opinion or we're trying to make a decision in a meeting, silence means you disagree. That's what they landed on. And basically, it's just to encourage the fact that we want to hear from everybody, right? So if you're not speaking up about this, we're going to assume that you don't necessarily agree with this. And so we're going to stay here for a while. I've seen that work well for groups of just getting more engagement.
Let me jump in. I like that one, because I think what I've heard too often, especially with executive teams and stuff, is that, well, I didn't say anything because I just agreed with what everybody was saying. Mm-hmm. What that looks like is non-participation, and it can be absolutely interpreted as you're not in agreement. So yeah, say something, jump in, tell us what you think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, we talked about this one before on the naughty list, but we're going to watch our airtime. right? If there's 5 of us in the meeting, 20%, roughly speaking, of the airtime is yours to use, right? And so being aware of that.
Let's say that one just because this has come up recently. One thing I'll be really clear about that. We talk sort of aspirationally about airtime math, right? The equation you just did, right? 20%, there's 5 people. At the same time, I want to help the group understand that we don't literally believe that everyone's going to participate on an equal level, because we have processors and expedients and lots of different reasons people may participate at different levels. And so we don't want the group to feel like they failed if they're not really equally participating. And there's going to be people that, frankly, they agree a couple times and they might say one thing, but they're in, right? They're very in. They're you can see they're in. They're participating. So I like the airtime math. I like being really careful of your airtime. Well, here's what I ask people to do. If you're a person who doesn't communicate or speak up very often, push yourself a little bit, right? Step in a bit. If you're that person, and you know who you are, because I'm one of them, who just has something to say about everything, pull back, maybe say 40% of the things you wanted to say. So kind of know where you're coming from as your sort of behavior style, and then adjust accordingly.
I've seen meeting behavior and the effectiveness of meetings really improve when teams do some sort of kind of behavioral style assessment work, behavioral style workshop. And one of the reasons why is, something that you mentioned, right? On a kind of a high level, we have, processors and we have expedients, and everybody's kind of somewhere along that continuum. Well, a commitment that I've seen people make in meetings is we need to make time and space for processors to process, right? If I have a question for people and I say, what do you all think? The expedients are going to quickly speak up. And then I say, okay, great. Anybody else? And on average, strangely enough, I've seen research that people will wait about 4 seconds before they move on, right? So a commitment that take a little more time, pause, let the processors process. And that could come in the form of, hey, let's do a quick small group here.
Yes.
Maybe a one-on-one. Let's put you in breakout rooms if remotely, or just a turn and talk if you're in person. That's a great opportunity for the processors to process, because now it's just kind of one-on-one and they have that space.
Yes, perfect. Yeah, so let's say we've worked through with our group these different behaviors that we want to avoid, that we want to commit to. Here's the thing. You've got a group and they're looking at this list. I guarantee you there's going to be very little debate. There's going to be very little controversy about this. There's a couple of the items that I think could be problematic. We'll talk about in a moment. But in general, I think that it's not that hard to get people on the same page. Do you think that's true with this, Ethan?
Yeah, when I've done this and I've seen other groups do it, most of these are just, I don't want to kind of no-brainers, because we don't always think of these things, but once they're out and articulated, it's like, yeah, why would I not want that? How can I not commit to that? There's usually pretty good buy-in with all this stuff. Like, who's going to say, no, I think we should give feedback disrespectfully to people. I don't agree that, or, I think we should be able to do other work during the meetings. All right. Most people are not going to, disagree with that, unless, of course, they're thinking, I disagree with that because we don't talk about anything that relates to me, right? But that's kind of part of setting up a good meeting. So yeah, I would agree. People usually are pretty comfortable with the stuff that comes up.
What's really interesting, the one example you gave, though, where it gets tricky, it's that one. It's the last one you mentioned. I think where I have seen quite often the controversy or the debate on this does have to do with multitasking. Mm-hmm. And it's for a variety of reasons. And the other one that comes up is camera or not camera on the remote.
Yes.
Those two have been problematic. And so, without probably going into the rationale today on these, I want to say that it's okay to, and this is high level decision-making options, really advanced stuff here, but you can actually mix your decision-making styles a little bit, right? So this is consensus, but let's keep in mind that as the manager, you get to play. You're in there too. You're part of this thing. And you might even have to use your power differential a little bit. You might have to say something like, hey, I after a great discussion, hey, I can see that we're not all on the same page on this thing around, using phones and doing other things during meetings, for example. I think this is where we're going to land on this. This is what I need. Now, if you're going to do that, of course, so what can I do, group, to make these meetings more effective so that you don't feel the need. Do I need to reduce meetings? Do we need to have less time in meetings? Do we need to make them more relevant? I want to make sure that part of this discussion is about me and what I can do to help make these meetings more effective. Because what I need from you are these things here, including not doing other work in the meeting.
Yep, exactly. Spot on. It's like, not to be too reductive here, but it's like there's probably two reasons why people might not agree with wanting to put away their work. They don't have enough time to do their work, right? They're in too many meetings, or these meetings are not relevant to them. So that's really good information to get as you improve these meetings, for sure. Now, on the keep your camera on, not keep your camera on controversy, it's a tough one. I mean, I remember when, kind of we were just starting to go under kind of the widespread COVID conditions of most people's work groups are now done remote. I remember, most people were saying, I think, yeah, we shouldn't have to have our cameras on if people are not comfortable with it. And I for a while, I think that was kind of the common logic. Like, yeah, let's not, people are at their homes, let's not turn but I've seen that shift lately with groups. Like a lot more groups are saying, no, we want our cameras on. But I mean, what are you kind of hearing out there? Why are people not wanting to put their cameras on, and how do we get people to understand kind of why that's important for an effective remote meeting?
Well, there's so many things to say about this whole return to work thing, but that's the thing that comes up right now. And you're right, there's a shift. And I think we have to be willing to say that we were doing what we were doing for a time, and now we're going to have to make some changes. And I'm seeing organizations realize that they do need to shift. And what they're landing on now, I think, which is really nice, is that let's be more intentional about who's home and who's not. And how many days you're home and who's not. There right now, which I'm really liking, people are now coming back to work at least for some of the week. And I think that's important. I support that. If there's going to be people working at home, and if that's something that we're supporting as an organization, we need to make sure that they have the right technology. We need to make sure that they're in an environment where it works, because I cannot have an effective meeting if half of my team is off camera or they're on camera and there's a whole bunch of things happening behind them and a lot of noise, and we just can't do it. And so we have to be more intentional about who's home and who's not, and what those spaces are like. And so that's sort of a more structural thing to kind of take care of first. But yeah, I think what we're saying now is that if it's a big, huge group and it's informational, much more open with people having their camera off. But if this is my team that I meet with every week to collaborate and do stuff together, no, we're going to show up, right? So I think we're just having to make some adjustments to those expectations. Well, so we've got these behaviors, we've together agreed, and again, you might have to insist on a few of these, and it's okay. You do have the right to do that. But now you've agreed as a group. Okay, so what do you do with that? I am a big believer in a verbal commitment. And that can happen right then as you've decided on these things. Another version I've seen and I like is the leader takes that list and writes it up and makes it pretty and brings it back, and everyone gets a chance to look at it one more time and make any edits. We do that together, and then it's there it is. And can we now commit to this? Can we all verbally say that, none of us are perfect, and we're not, and I'm going to commit to certain things as a leader to make these meetings effective, but can we all agree that these are the behaviors that we're shooting for, and these are the behaviors we're going to avoid? And so that becomes a commitment that we make together. And then the question becomes, how do you make that sticky, right? How do you make that not a flavor of the year? There's certainly things you're going to want to do in the meetings that we can talk about another time, but there's facilitation things we can do when those behaviors come up. But Ethan, let me ask you this: what might a manager or a group do if they want those commitments to become part of the culture of that meeting over time, in a sense, become sticky?
Well, two kind of low-hanging fruit here is practice them yourself, hold yourself accountable for them. I mean, that's the easiest way to break these, for these commitments to just go out the window, is if you're not practicing them. So you, as the leader or facilitator of this group, has to be super diligent about staying on track with this stuff. And then B, it's about holding other people accountable, right? And there's ways to do that. I'm not saying that you have to call people out in meetings every time they, interrupt somebody or take up too much airtime or whatever. But just remembering that commitments are only as good as, the leader and the rest of the team is at holding each other and themselves accountable for it. Not letting things slide, having a one-on-one conversation with somebody after the fact to remind them of these commitments that we've made.
Yeah. What you allow, you teach. And so in the meeting, mention something. If it's, hey, everybody, remember, put your phones away, or like you said, one-on-one. Also bringing these commitments out periodically and just evaluating. That's a really important piece. Just don't tuck this away somewhere and never think about it or talk about it again, right? Get those out maybe 3 months later and do some review and check in, maybe do it another 3 months later, then maybe change to 6 months. But yeah, keep them on the radar. When a new person comes in, acclimate them to it, onboard them so they understand the commitments, maybe redo these commitments after a year just to make sure we're not missing anything. Yeah, well, there's some stuff, right? There's sort of a quick look at ways we can help our teams adopt and uphold some commitments to great meeting behaviors. So I hope that was helpful for our listeners. We have a new segment that we started recently, and it is answering listener questions. So this is not an easy one, but I'm gonna throw it at you. So how do I know if my employees find me approachable? It's not like they're going to tell me if I'm not.
Good point.
I've actually heard this several times when we've talked about psychological safety and defensiveness, et cetera. How do I know if I'm not showing up as approachable? What do you think?
Well, it's a good question. A couple things come to mind. Yeah, to your point, if you're not approachable, they're not gonna tell you that you're not approachable. And so, I would still say that there is an effort to be made to ask people one-on-one. Yeah, you might not get honest answers if you're really, really unapproachable, but maybe just start with like, hey, if you suspect that you might not be as approachable as you need to be, start with a little vulnerability and humility, right? Sit down with each of your direct reports one-on-one and say, look, at one thing I'm trying to get better at, improve at, is just being more approachable. I'm not sure how approachable I am. I really don't know. That's why I want to ask you. And, I just want you to know that I want to have this conversation with you with a lot of humility, a lot of grace. I just want to hear your opinion on it. So I think the way you frame that conversation, even if you are unapproachable, can maybe open them up a little bit to be honest with you. And of course, you have to take that feedback non-defensively, and you have to take it for what it is and not try to push back too much since you're asking the question. So that's one way. So you're saying I shouldn't say, hey, I'm approachable, aren't I? Aren't I? Yeah, exactly. It's the approach, it's the humility, it's even leaning into, hey, I might not be as approachable as I thought I was. Can you help me with this? I think there's a lot of really cool ways to approach that. And then you also focused on that other piece, which is, even if you ask it well, you can completely destroy the opportunity by then getting defensive with what they said. Another thought would be to give them some choices, or actually narrow it down a little bit. So for example, you might say, hey, what are some behaviors that you've seen from me that make it harder for people to be honest with me? What are some things you've seen me do or say that make it harder for people to give me feedback, right? So you're actually really focusing them in on a very specific thing you want, and you're including the negative kind of right there in the question. You're giving them permission, in a sense, to give you the answer to that question. But again, you can't then respond with, well, when do I do that? Or I don't do that. And I think you can pair that question. I like that start there, kind of the negative there. Hey, what are you seeing me doing that makes me less approachable or prevents you from giving me feedback? And keeping that kind of an open-ended question, like you said it, right? As opposed to, am I approachable, right? Do you feel like I'm open to feedback from you? Right. That's an answer that can be answered with yes or no, and you're going to get a lot less candid response in most cases. And then I think you can, and then ask the kind of the positive inverse of that, which is, okay, thanks for that feedback. What are things that I can do more of to make you more comfortable giving me feedback, right? And so you get some really good information there. Another thing, and if this tool is available to you, I think 360-degree review processes are invaluable, right? Mm-hmm. If you have suspicions that your team's not comfortable giving you that feedback, set up a process in which you go to your team and you say, hey, again, with a whole lot of humility, I have things to work on. I know I have a lot of blind spots. And the thing about blind spots is you don't know what they are. And so I'm inviting you all to this 360 review process. We're going to have kind of a third party come in. These are going to be 100% confidential interviews. It'll be anonymous. And I really hope that you'll, be honest in these conversations, right? So just kind of having a third party come in to do that tends to produce, some more honest feedback that you can take and use to improve.
Right. And I wish we knew an organization we could recommend for that sort of thing.
No clue.
Nope.
All righty, folks. That's all we have time for today. I appreciate you listening in. Please share this with other people that may benefit from this. And really the best way you can support us is by leaving us a review. Leaving a review helps other people find the show, and we would sure appreciate it. So until another time.